Welcome to the Chimera Open Mic, where you have the opportunity to hear new work from up-and-coming writers. Our first reader is Hannah Faoilean. Hannah lives in Edinburgh and writes YA fantasy, short stories and poems. She's had a short story published in Dreamcatcher literary magazine and will soon have a piece of microfiction published in Grindstone 2020 Winners Anthology. She is reading from her YA fantasy, Spell.
Hello, I'm Hannah Faoilean, and this is an extract from my YA fantasy which I hope to publish. It's about a princess who became trapped inside a wolf and the girl who rescued her. Spell. Princess Emelina sat in a clearing in the forest, on a cushion to keep her white silk clean. She liked her 17th birthday gown. She did not know that in a few moments she would have no need for clothes. She looked at the food spread out before her, pies, sugared strawberries, wine, marchpane, and pressed her hands to her stomach. She had eaten enough. So it seemed to everyone else. Her mother was leaning against a tree, her head cocked in a sleeping position. Her brother, Prince Han, lay on the dry leaves beside the feast cloth, one leg straight, one bent leg fallen to the side. Only the two guards remained alert, scanning the edges of the clearing, looking for poachers. Emelina bunched up her gown, stepped over the food, and went to where the sun poured light on a patch of white butterfly orchids and pink herb Robert. The pink petals would look pretty in her blonde hair. She would wake her mother, get her to braid them into a plait. The guards' gazes followed her movement. She gave them her eyebrow raised. Watch for poachers, not me, look. Then they did as commanded. Holding her skirt out so she would not crush or stain it, she knelt, broke off a pink flower stalk, reached for another, thunder growled. She looked up, ducked at the lightning crack, flung her arms across her face as trees thudded to the ground. Then it stopped. No more noise. She lowered her arms, petals squashed in her grip, and froze. Fallen trunks lay over her family, over the guards, her mother's gloved hand, her brother's booted legs, all that still showed. Mother? Han? Her voice came out breathless. Mother? They must not be dead. They must crawl out. A wolf sprang into the clearing, bounded towards her. She scrambled to her feet, turned, tripped over her hamline, saw the wolf above her. She pushed at the weight of the belly that landed on her face and her chest. The fur parted, her fingers touching warm skin. The skin parted, her fingers sinking into flesh, then space as if it was hollow. Her body left the ground. The wolf was sucking her in. Underneath her, a slapping sound of the belly shutting. Then darkness, warm dampness, and the stench like a hanging carcass. As she twisted in the body, her legs slid into wolf legs. She scrunched her face, nausea surging up her throat. Heart hammering, she pressed against where the opening must have been, scratched and scratched at what felt like raw meat, her fingernails filling with slime. No, let me out! Mother! Her voice had no sound. Why? She pressed and pounded. Let me out! But instead of pounding at flesh, her efforts sank her arms down wolf legs as her carrier rose to a four-legged stand. Wolf muscles tightened, forcing her head and neck upwards. Leaves came into view, not green, but yellow, and herb Robert petals, not pink, but brownish-grey. She was seeing through the wolf eyes, and smelling through its nose. As the long, pale-grey snout sniffed the air, an explosion of scent bombarded her. The sweetness of orchids, a mousy aroma, the dampness of earth, wolf musk. She braced herself as her view spun. And there, her mother's hand, her brother's legs. Go to them, she silently screamed. Let me out, let me hold mother's hand. She tried to step with her arms, push with her knees, but her limbs hardly moved, and the wolf turned away. Inside, Emelina realized she had no control. Each year heard different things from different directions. A twig snap as loud as rockfall, a branch creak, birds' deafening chatter, and the rumble of horse hooves. Father! She squirmed, punched, kicked, tiny, useless movements. Father, save me! He would not hear, But his sorcerer was here. His sorcerer would save her. And if, under that tree, her mother and brother still lived... She smelt horse sweat, wet leather, man odour. She sensed the wolf's thoughts. Hunters or the evil man returned. Intricate detail of fern and tree flashed by as the wolf sped her away into the shadows behind the trees. East.
Our next reader is Geoffrey Palms. Geoffrey is an MFA candidate in creative writing at the University of Glasgow, where he researches how music can challenge notions of progress in science fiction. Separately, his non-fiction book, I'm Having a Knippchen, will be published by Black Fountain Press in July 2021. Geoffrey is reading from his novel, Electriano. Enjoy.
Hello, my name is Geoffrey Palms, and I'd like to read from my work in progress, a science fiction novel called Electriano. The setting of the book involves a futuristic music scene, and this excerpt from Chapter 5 takes place in a neo-jazz club. A few shouts and claps announced the arrival of the band to the stage. I hadn't caught the name of the group anywhere. The Yantoon wasn't much for publicity or organised fanfare, or maybe the acts they had here were, on average, better left unadvertised. "We are the Cut Plastic Quartet," announced the drummer of what I now knew was the Cut Plastic Quartet. The name was left untranslated from one of the Old Earth languages, a popular convention for young bands. "Yevizen Cut Plastic Quartet." A table in the back whooped. The amateur vibe of the Yantoon suggested to me that these were personal guests of the performers, although you never know. Even microfilm can lasso a few true fans. Without any further preamble, the quartet took up their positions. I took a long drink of my house beer. The drummer counted off 2 bars of 7, accented in the traditional Lear heartbeat rhythm of ti-ti-ti-ti-ti-ti, whereafter the sound of the band hit like a warm ocean wave. A coordinated opening lick, sometimes nicknamed a prologue, quickly resolved into a mid-tempo groove. It had been a long time since I was at a neo-jazz gig that wasn't on the circuit, and this fact struck me now because Cut Plastic's prologue didn't weird the room even a little. Professionals of the caliber I was used to seeing were so comfortable with metagraphics that weirding came second nature to them. You didn't play a note without brightening a color in the room, diamonding the light, refracting audience noise, etc. Being that used to the prose, you might forget that the instruments can even function without a metagraphical dimension. So right off the pop, I thought, these cats stink. I tried to fight this opinion for the sake of the youngsters on stage, but didn't succeed until the edges of the room finally began to twinkle. When it was clear that they were capable of some weirding, at least, I finally relaxed. They could play neo-jazz, just with a lot of effort. This was a gig at the Yantoon, I reminded myself. No reviewers, no cover charges, no pressure. It was just kids playing music for the love of it. It took triple the time a proper ensemble would need, but Cut Plastic eventually cleared the barroom of sharp corners and volume hues and bad light, creating the grey out that they wanted. To their credit, the groove hadn't slackened in character at all during this process, despite the obvious efforts they were expending on the build. The uprightest even managed to produce some catchy tonal attack, in this and other ways distinguishing herself as the most talented of the quartet. When the electrionist, in contrast, nearly missed the cue to loop the grey out on 0 volume, I nearly yelled out. He could have cost them the entire number. The room now sufficiently greyed out, Cut Plastic finally began architecting their sus world. The neo-sax and the electrionist blew stretching notes that slowly turned the sticky bar floor into a bed of browned pine needles, after which the group modulated, somewhat clumsily, into a higher neo key, in which they went to work on a forest canopy. By dint of a series of quintuplets, riffed by the sax and electrionist in unison, each pattern of 5 accented on 1 and 4 by the drummer, they shaded the room with a thick tangle of leaves that the subdued tectonics of the uprightist's bass line glowed up into a dim, electric shade of green. That was a nice effect. The sax and electriano kept the ostinato going, the regularity of which was repeating the design of the canopy into the distance. The Yantoon was fast disappearing as the audience became more and more suspended. Soon enough, I found myself alone in a forest. Forests were all the rage in neo-jazz just then. On a societal level, they spoke to the dried-up, burnt-out earth, the recent and final abandonment of which was the new generation's Lennox Wood, my generation's Lennox Wood, I guess. As such, art forms of all kinds had taken a decidedly preservational turn. Preservational in tone, that is, since no more preservation in act was possible. Maybe reminiscent or elegiac are better words for it. The popularity of archaic words from Earth languages was surely part of the same movement. On a technical level, meanwhile, the current chop standard was how well you could play patterns of daylight or twilight filtering across leaves, there being about a bazillion different ways for a neo-jazz musician to improvise color and movement schematics. I looked around at what was once a bar. Dark woods now extended in every direction, a thin mist growing thick at the edges of my vision as darkness peeled eventually into frame. The forest was lonesome and empty, humming with saxophonic wind. Daylight drummed through the foliage like shattered spotlights onto a sea of dried pine needles, a prickling sound effect courtesy of the drummer's cymbal work. Thanks for listening.
Next up is Ellis Saxey. Ellis is a queer Londoner who works in universities. Their short fiction has appeared in Apex Magazine, Best of British Fantasy 2019, The Future Fire, and others. They are performing their piece Until 100 Generations.
I'm Ellis Saxey, and this poem is called Until 100 Generations of People Have Departed. It's based on the 1993 Sandia Report nuclear waste warnings. You may know them. This is not a place of honour is one of their more striking phrases. It's a translation into Old English, partly to demonstrate the point of the Sandia Report that no language can be continuously understood for as long as a nuclear waste warning needs to last. The poem's going to be coming out in The Future Fire magazine, and thanks to Thijs Polk for his help, and apologies for the pronunciation errors. What? Theos moldsto is a render, in an minnen younger webjewerka. Listen, this sepulchre is a message, within a web of warnings. We descend on this ward, bielo spell need Mitchell. We sent this warning, a baleful, urgent message. We bethotten or a Theoda, thriftswither, und little earmanstrinde. We thought our people exceedingly powerful, a great generation. Here nisnan elended yemin yud, ne eal yestreon bidulfen, ne forsettle, ne frail sto. Here is no honourable deed commemorated, nor ancient treasure buried, no high seat of honour, nor festival ground. We foughted on and hatted on what is here. We feared and hated what is here. This bialo spell wanath, that while fear, wext, to middenweada. Here ritlicha is seo alamida. This dire message warns that deathly fire grows greater towards the middle. Right here is the centre. We hit Russen Haelstra Berion. We hid it in the darkness of the earth. Hit hath heanessa and langnessa. It has height and length. Her winneth yet se wildcraft. Nu swaswa on urum deum. The deadly power still dwells here, now just as in our time. Seo frekenus freknath barnhus. On fordon me. The danger threatens the body and may kill. Se bealo gleoth, bredeth to utweada. The malice glows, broadening outwards. If ye delphin on dreffen, dreeten bealo ye unbinden. If you dig and disturb, you will unbind great misery. Forbuyath vas moldstoa, und man leasa va yaremath. Shun this tomb and leave it uninhabited.
Reading next is Matthew Wasley. Matthew is a sometime writer living in Edinburgh. He has had 2 whole jokes broadcast on Newsjack. His last novel featured an alien AI inhabiting a shed, and he is currently working on one that involves a Datsun cherry in space. For our open mic, he is reading from The Shed.
I was in the committee room again. I want to know what's going on, I thought. I told you, it said. It's difficult to explain. That doesn't mean I'm not going to. It's just that it will take some time. The committee room, as you call it, is part of a process of acclimatisation. Your brain is not yet complex enough to cope. Why don't you try me? Very well. Let's begin with this room. What you are experiencing here is a translation of a series of communications between the dominant species in this galaxy. Galactic species? It's a bunch of men and one woman in suits in an oak-panelled conference room. It is a representation tailored to suit your mind. This room fits your image of where important decisions take place, and the people in it fit your expectation of who makes those decisions. Really? Really? So what does it actually look like? This. The committee room and the people in it vanished, and everything went black. I had a sense of being suspended in an impossibly vast, empty space. I tried waving a hand in front of my face, but I couldn't see anything. I couldn't feel anything either. I was no longer sure I had a body. I tried to calm the rising sense of anxiety by taking deep breaths, but then realised I wasn't breathing at all. I gasped from a non-existent mouth in terror, flailing my non-existent arms around, clutching at my non-existent throat. This went on for some time until I gradually realised I was still alive and calmed down somewhat. Breathing was obviously not required here, wherever here was. A number of spots of light appeared. They were just points, and it was impossible to tell whether they were right in front of me or light years distant. I counted them for something to do. There were 20 in all, roughly equally spaced around me in 3 dimensions. Somehow I'd been able to count the ones behind me. They began to grow larger and larger, changing from pinpricks to discs with mottled colour, that then resolved into spheres with intricate fractal patterns, constantly changing as they drew closer, rushing towards me at breakneck speed. I heard sound too, a cacophony of rumbling bass beats and high-pitched screams, all the time getting louder and louder. There was smell. Lavender, sewage, bleach, cut grass, vomit, chestnuts, warm bread, and countless more that I couldn't place. And taste. So many flavours vying for attention, making me first ravenously hungry and then giving me an urgent desire to retch, if only I had a stomach to do so. The colours on the spheres continually shifted, the patterns swirling and chopping faster and faster as the noise became unbearable and the taste became overwhelming. And then, when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the spheres slammed full pelt into my consciousness and everything became 1,000 times stronger and harder. I screamed as the overwhelming assault of sense drove red-hot pokers and needles of ice through my brain. I wanted to die, to end this torture that I was enduring. No, more than that, I wanted to have never been born, to have never known that this sheer volume of hell could be inflicted on me, or anyone. With every atom of my being, I wished for the universe to end and a total void of non-existence to replace this hideous energy. And then I was sitting back in the conference room, where Julian was rattling off facts about thermonuclear stockpiles. I needed to curl up in a ball on the floor, but the besuited version of me sat calmly in the chair doing its own thing, nodding occasionally and making notes. Instead, I lay in a metaphorical corner of my mind until I felt ready to return.
A big camera welcome to our last reader, Zebib K.A. Zebib K.A. is a writer and psychiatrist. She is completing a master's in creative writing at the University of Edinburgh. She has been published in The Rumpus, Apparition Lit, and more. She is finishing her first novel, a sci-fi psychological thriller, at the moment. Her open mic reading is the story The Body in Seams.
The Body in Seams. On the first sub-zero night of winter in Colorado, the 13.5 tog-down duvet pressed heavily on her chest. It had been years since they'd broken up, and now he was dead. Mira told people she accepted the way events ordered themselves. Closure was simply a matter of shutting the door on the past. In the morning, the sun rose brighter than it had for weeks. She tugged on fleece trousers, a forgotten present from her mother, found days ago in the back of her dusty closet. She sipped coffee and read the news as if the car crash had happened to some other man living some other life. The cold prickled into March. She drank cheap beers at happy hour after work, ate dinner with her family on Sundays. Most days his death barely grazed her consciousness, but then her focus on work began to falter. Forcing her attention back onto the task at hand, her mind strayed, back to him and the curled mass of those lonely years. A simple fight had been the final straw, but in truth they had been crumbling for years under the weight of a slow, angry rot. Once free, she refused to look back, onwards and upwards, away from his pervasive insecurities, his loitering presence, his constant stream of texts demanding to know where she was and with whom. It was supposed to be spring, but the buds of flowers halted on the branch, hesitant to commit to a full bloom. Some nights the moon shone so brightly it appeared to overtake every star and man-made point of light in the vicinity. In April she walked to the morning bus. The cold hurt. Those fleece pants, usually warm, let in small gusts of icy air over her legs. Removing her gloves, she felt stray threads that had come undone at erratic intervals. Days later, the same thing happened with another pair of pants. In a week, every pair of pants she owned had developed small seam failures. As she bought more clothes and tried to stay warm, memories nagged at her, looping along the same circuits of her brain. Those first sweet months, slowly turning to something else. At first, his eyes glazing over when she spoke, then a silent anger which became a constant. Every good week followed by a bad month. He ignored her, he suddenly cared, and then he wanted to injure. There was blame to assign, and he meant it for her. It wasn't until the ache of not sleeping filled her whole body that she remembered how she'd wished him dead. There were slow changes during that stubborn early spring. The lengthening of daylight, a dry pollen brush sharpness to the air. At night she started to hear the small sounds of friction, rubbing, the rough slide of a string through a slot. The old Persian rug she'd bought with him on a distant vacation started to fray at its border. The tassels she'd taken care to cautiously vacuum were now barely hanging on. Her clothes were coming apart at the seams. Bags fell off their hooks as handles dismembered themselves at alarming speed from their bodies. The strange new phenomenon swept through her apartment, an impossibly fast wear and tear. Pulling her clothes before the sun, she saw the manufactured textiles shot through with light. The stitches, handmade and automated, came undone. Every inspection turned up no result. No termites, no infestation, no chemical leaking into the air. Every precaution of washing did nothing. Everywhere she spotted the fallen threads of reflective silk, wispy cotton, stiff nylon, and polyester. At night, she heard the sounds of ripping, loosening. The space of her apartment contained the expansiveness of a dark city. She ordered new clothes online. They disintegrated. When their old yellow blanket fell off her bed one morning, separated into sheets of cotton and dusty fillings, she nearly cracked. New haphazard furniture took up residence in her apartment. Clothless leather love seats, plastic office chairs, and eventually all was hardwood, plastic, and metal. All of Mira's clothes were now plastic, futuristic structures, with dark blue circles under her eyes and thinner limbs peeking out of her stranger clothes. Friends worried for her stability. When the weather began to break, crouching towards warmth, all the closets stuffed with tangled threads and yarn, she began to understand that certain events had not been laid to rest. Mourning was unavoidable, not just for his death, but for what their relationship had done to her, the difficult-to-describe destruction that had reared its head and slipped through every crevice and structure that clothed and warmed her. In the freshness of spring, she let herself dwell on it, sit with what had happened. She had to mourn herself, him, both hated, both denied. Some days she sat so long on the oak chair in the middle of her apartment that her legs went numb, untangled so many threads that blood trickled out of her dry nasal passages. And when every thread was organized by shape, color, consistency, every door left open, when Mira lay down on a neat pile of loose cloth and tufts of cotton like clouds, she finally slept through the night. Her new clothes remained intact and snug around her body.